The river town lay low and unhurried in the winter light, its streets stitched together by the slow bend of the water and the narrow lanes that carried the sound of footsteps like whispers. In 1894, nothing here seemed urgent. The fishermen hauled their nets at the same hours their fathers had. The mill wheels turned with a patient groan, and the church bell of St. Aurelia's rang at 6 and again at 9, as it had for generations. Those two chimes each morning and evening were the town's heartbeat, steady and unquestioned, a signal to pray, to rise, to rest. Beneath its tower, the convent walls stood pale against the sky, their stones worn smooth by decades of wind. The sisters moved inside like shadows on water, always seen in pairs, their heads bowed, their voices low. They taught the orphans, tended the sick, and baked bread for the poor. No one doubted their goodness, and perhaps that was the first mistake. No one ever doubted anything here. It was not that people didn't notice when a face disappeared from the orphanage windows or when a child's name ceased to be called at morning roll. They noticed in the way one notices the changing of the seasons. Quietly, without alarm, as though it were part of the order of things. There were explanations if one cared to ask. A relative in another town had taken them in. Illness had claimed them. The bishop had reassigned them to a different home. The answers were gentle, tidy, and left no room for suspicion. But the truth was that people in this place had learned not to pull at threads. Silence here was a virtue, and virtues were to be kept. In the tavern at the edge of the quay, the old men spoke of the convent with a kind of reverence laced with superstition. They said the bell was older than the building itself, cast in a far-off city where a plague had once burned half the streets clean. It was said the metal still carried the prayers of those who had died unheard, and that its sound could stir the soul of anyone within earshot. Whether that was a blessing or a warning was never made clear. But when the two short peals came each morning and evening, all work stopped, all voices hushed, and for a breath the whole town seemed to listen. What the people could not hear, or chose not to, was the faint shift beneath that sound, the hidden ledger being written in another language entirely. Behind the convent's locked doors, the rhythm of the bell marked something else, something private. Each chime was a boundary, a beginning and an end, not of prayer but of a cycle that had nothing to do with God. The sisters had their chores, their rules, their silence. And in that silence, one among them found room to cultivate something darker. Those who passed St. Aurelia's after dark sometimes claimed they saw a lone candle flicker in the attic window. Long after Compline had been said, they would joke in the way people joke to hide unease that perhaps the sisters were keeping watch for souls in purgatory. No one stopped to consider that the light might belong to hands busy with something that could not be done in daylight, in a place where the river froze hard in winter and the streets emptied by nightfall. It was easy to imagine that anything happening behind stone walls was holy by default. Years later, when the town could no longer avoid speaking of what had lived inside those walls, people would remember how the air always seemed colder in the street that ran along the convent's back garden, even in summer. They would recall the way the orphans never played near the fence, as though they understood without being told that it was not a place for laughter. At the time, those details seemed too small to matter. Life was comfortable in its boundaries. The bell rang at 6, then 9. People slept, people woke, people buried their dead without counting too closely how many there were. And in that unbroken stillness, a mind that understood patience found everything it needed. The undoing of the town would not come in the form of fire or flood or war, but in the slow unspooling of the very silence it cherished. It would come when the chimes that had once soothed its people would ring with a weight they could not bear, when the spaces between the notes would feel crowded with all the questions they had never asked. For now, In the winter of 1894, St. Aurelia stood untouchable, its walls pale and clean, its shadow stretching long across the cobblestones. The bell's voice drifted across the river, carrying both comfort and warning, though no one knew it yet. And inside, somewhere above the chapel, a single candle burned, marking the beginning of a story that no one in the town had the courage to imagine. Sister Miriam's hands were the first thing most children noticed about her. They were pale and dry, with a faint smell of lavender oil, the kind of hands that could smooth a fevered brow without waking the patient. In the infirmary of St. Aurelia's, where the air always held the scent of boiled linen and camphor, she moved with the quiet certainty of someone who understood suffering. She remembered each child's name, their favorite hymns, the last thing they had eaten before they fell ill. Her voice never rose, her steps never hurried, and to the sisters who worked beside her, she seemed like a gift, an anchor in times when sickness swept through the orphanage and beds filled faster than they could be emptied. The ledgers she kept were precise, each line written in her careful hand, noting temperatures, symptoms, and the progression of every illness. To the casual eye, they were a testament to devotion. But beneath the floorboards of her room, under the loose plank she alone knew how to lift, another set of ledgers told a different story, one that recorded not healing but decline. Each page of the hidden books was marked with strange symbols instead of names, and the columns did not track recovery but loss. The hour a child could no longer swallow, the day they stopped speaking, the minute their pulse weakened past saving. It was not the language of care, but of calculation. To Sister Miriam, illness was not an enemy to defeat, but a process to refine. She had learned over years of observation how to guide a body toward death without leaving a mark that any physician would question. It was a slow art, and she practiced it with the patience of someone tending a garden, trimming life away in small, invisible increments. No one noticed the pattern, not because it was hidden, but because it was threaded so seamlessly into the fabric of the orphanage's life. Children died everywhere in those years. From influenza, from the chill that settled in their lungs during the long winters, from accidents no one could prevent. The world expected a certain number of graves. Miriam understood this, and she used it as a veil. Each season she allowed some to live, feeding them broth, coaxing them to sit up in bed, smiling when they took their first steps again. Others she kept in the balance, not so sick as to draw alarm, but never well enough to leave her care. She would sit beside them at night, her hand on their chest to feel the shallow rise and fall, murmuring prayers as though she were speaking to God, though the words she whispered were meant only for herself. In her mind, there was a purity in the moment when the body crossed from life into death. She did not believe it happened suddenly. To her, it was a delicate threshold, a narrow place the soul lingered in before it was gone entirely. She wanted to catch that moment, to understand it, to see if it could be shaped. And so she began to experiment in ways no one imagined. Sometimes she withheld water until the lips cracked, then allowed a single sip, watching the body's brief surge of relief before it failed again. Other times she altered the bedding, making it damp and cold to keep the fever from rising too fast. She had learned how to stretch the dying into days, even weeks, holding her subjects in a place between worlds where their eyes remained open but their voices had gone. When the end came, it was always the same. A soft pressing of her fingers at the pulse point, a pause to feel the final flutter, and then she would fold their hands over their chest as if in prayer. The sisters believed it was a kindness, that she had stayed with them so they would not pass alone. They did not see the satisfaction in her eyes when she recorded the time in both ledgers, in one as an act of mercy and the other as a precise entry in her private work. In the village below, the people spoke of her as a woman touched by grace. She would attend funerals with the same calm as she did Mass, her head bowed, her lips moving silently in prayer. Mothers pressed her hands in thanks for tending to their sick children, never knowing those same hands had guided others away from life. The orphans themselves seemed to trust her most of all, perhaps sensing that in her presence nothing would happen without her knowing. And they were right. The bell tower marked her days, its chimes a constant in the background of her work. She began to measure the children's decline by those chimes, noticing how certain stages aligned perfectly with their rhythm. Over time, she began to time her final ministrations to them, making the end arrive exactly when the bell rang twice. It was not a chance, it was controlled. And control was what she loved most, muttered. Not over life in its full chaos, but over the narrowing, ordered path toward its end. Years would pass before anyone thought to ask why it was always her at the bedside when the final breath came, why her ledger books were never examined too closely, why no child ever died suddenly under her watch. But by then she would have refined her art so completely that even suspicion could not touch her. For now, she moved among the sick with her gentle smile, her soft hands and her patient, methodical gaze, the perfect guardian for a place where no one believed evil could exist, and where the silence of the town was still the safest cover she could have. In the deep winter of 1895, when the river lay locked under ice and the convent gardens were buried beneath snow, the first signs appeared in the dormitories. It began quietly, without the fanfare of a true epidemic. A single boy woke one morning unable to speak, his lips moving soundlessly as if words were trapped somewhere behind his teeth. By evening, 2 more children had the same affliction. The fever came next. Not the wild, burning fever of influenza, but a steady, controlled heat that never spiked and never broke. It was the kind of sickness that felt managed, as if an invisible hand were keeping it on a leash. The town doctor visited once, baffled by the lack of cough, rash, or inflammation. He suggested rest, fluids, and prayer. Within a week, the boy was dead, his body thin but oddly unmarked, and the 2 others followed soon after. More cases appeared, and with each one the pattern held. First, the voice would fail, a slow muting as if the sickness began not in the lungs or blood but somewhere deeper, at the root of expression itself. Then within days the legs would weaken until standing was impossible. The children would remain awake, alert even, their eyes tracking the movements of the sisters around them, but their bodies refusing to obey. On the 9th day, without struggle or visible pain, their hearts would stop. The regularity of it should have been alarming, but to those inside the convent walls it was spoken of as coincidence, a strange but natural turn of fate in a harsh winter. Villagers whispered curses, recalling the old stories about the bell that could pull souls from the living. They imagined dark air creeping through the orphanage at night, stealing voices so that prayers could not be spoken. Yet when a delegation asked to examine the infirmary, the sisters politely refused, explaining that the children were fragile and rest was their only hope. The delegation accepted this. In a town where faith was woven into survival, doubting the convent's word felt like doubting God. But there were records, 2 kinds. The official ledgers listed the usual illnesses, names marked with the sign of the cross on the day of death, cause written simply as fever. The hidden ledgers, locked away beneath Sister Miriam's floorboards, were far more exacting. They charted each symptom to the hour. The moment a child's voice failed, the precise time their legs gave way, the measured decline of their pulse. Alongside these notations were tiny marks in the margins, symbols only Miriam understood. They were not medical signs, but something older, almost liturgical. It was as though she was following a script written long before the sickness began. In truth, the illness was no illness at all, but a sequence Miriam had designed herself. A 9-day journey from health to death, crafted through a blend of deprivation, controlled exposure, and tinctures whose ingredients she never shared. She believed that the body's surrender was only complete when the mind was still fully aware, and so she adjusted her methods until each victim remained conscious until the final hour. The loss of voice was not a symptom, but a condition she induced with subtle doses that numbed the throat and tongue, ensuring silence. The inability to stand came from the gradual weakening of muscles starved of both nourishment and rest. The fever was engineered to be constant but never high enough to trigger suspicion, a false signal that misled anyone searching for the usual causes of death. No doctor could have unraveled it then because it was never truly disease. It was choreography. Miriam had built it step by step, each stage serving a purpose, each death a piece of her greater study. She did not see herself as a killer in the common sense. To her, she was a conductor, guiding her subjects through a composition that only she could hear. The 9-day span was sacred, the number holding weight in her private theology. She spoke of it to no one, but in her mind, 9 was the time it took for the soul to become fully untethered, hovering in a state she believed she could reach for, perhaps even hold. By spring, the sickness seemed to vanish as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind 13 graves in the churchyard, their wooden markers already weathering under the thaw. The townspeople spoke of it as a strange season, a trial sent by God, and moved on. Inside the convent, Miriam moved on as well, her public face serene, her gentle hands as trusted as ever. But in her hidden ledger, she had written in her careful script, "Cycle complete. Begin again when ready." The bell tower chimed in the distance, and she listened, already measuring how the next set of days might fall. The convent basement smelled of grain and damp stone, the air cool enough to keep flour sacks dry through the seasons. That was what anyone would see if they descended the narrow steps during the day. Rows of burlap bags stacked neatly against the walls, a few crates of root vegetables, the occasional barrel of dried beans. But behind a locked door at the far end, in a space no one else had reason to enter, Sister Miriam kept a different kind of store. Here the air was heavier, not with the scent of food, but with something metallic and stale. This was where she worked without the constraints of the infirmary, where no curious eyes could interrupt her lessons. She called them that in her own mind, lessons in the language of the soul's departure. She had come to believe through years of private study that the human soul did not vanish all at once at death, but lingered in the body for a fraction of time, a fraction she imagined could be measured if one knew exactly when to look. Her ambition was not to witness death, but to hold the subject in that fraction for as long as possible, to study the invisible weight that hovered between this world and whatever came next. And so she began to design conditions in which the body could be kept at the very edge, neither alive enough to escape her control nor dead enough to release what she wanted to see. The space she prepared for this work was stripped of light. The windows were bricked over, the walls bare except for hooks where she hung her tools, lengths of canvas strapping, jars of tinctures, small wooden wedges worn smooth from use. In the center of the room stood a narrow cot she had raised onto blocks so she could work at a comfortable height. A makeshift bellows, borrowed from the convent's blacksmith shop and altered with tubing, was fixed at the head of the bed, its slow, rhythmic squeeze keeping air moving into the lungs of whoever lay there. She had learned to keep the breath shallow, just enough to keep the brain alert but the body starved for strength. Her tinctures were brewed from plants gathered in the outskirts of the village, their properties altered by hours of boiling and cooling, mixing and straining until they were unrecognizable. Some slowed the heart to a crawling rhythm. Others dulled the reflexes without touching the mind. She administered them drop by drop, watching the pupils for the first sign of detachment. She took notes on everything: the color of the skin, the moisture in the eyes, the way a hand might twitch when the bell outside struck the hour. Every reaction was part of her chart, a map she was building toward the precise border she sought. The children she brought here never screamed for long. After the first hours, the darkness and the stillness drained their resistance. They would lie awake, eyes open, breathing in time with the bellows, unable to move more than a finger. Miriam spoke to them in the same calm voice she used in the infirmary, telling them it was important they remain still, that they were helping her understand something sacred. Sometimes she prayed aloud, but the words were not prayers the church would recognize. She spoke as if she were inviting something unseen into the room, something she expected to come when the body's defenses were at their weakest. Her greatest challenge was knowing when she had reached the edge. Too soon, and the body would recover. Too late, and she would miss the fraction she wanted. She began experimenting with timed pulses of air from the bellows, holding them for just long enough to make the eyes glaze without letting the lids fall shut. She counted the beats of the slowed heart against the chimes from the tower above, trying to align them so that the exact instant of departure would fall under the toll of the bell. To her, the sound was not a marker of time, but a signal, a calling to whatever force she believed would answer. When the moment came, she always knew. The body would stiffen almost imperceptibly, the eyes fixed on nothing, the mouth barely parting as if to release a word that could not be spoken. She would lean close, her own breath steady, feeling for a change in the air. Something she imagined was the soul itself slipping past her. Then she would release the bellows, letting the breath fade, and note the time with absolute precision. Sometimes she kept the body for hours afterward, watching for any trace of return, testing her theory that the soul might hover near before leaving for good. When her work was done, the room would be scrubbed, the tools put away, the cot stripped, and the grain sacks rearranged to hide any sign of disturbance. The victim would be carried back to the infirmary and laid in bed as if death had come quietly in sleep. By morning, Miriam's hands would be folded in prayer, her face a portrait of loss, speaking softly of God's mercy. No one would wonder why her gaze lingered not on the face of the dead but on the empty space just above it, as though she still expected to see something there. And in her mind, she was already planning the next lesson, refining the steps, certain she was drawing closer to the truth she had devoted herself to finding. For Sister Miriam, the end was never improvised. It arrived with a precision she guarded like scripture, measured down to the very second the convent bell rang twice. To her, the double chime was not simply a marker of time, but a kind of net cast into the unseen, startling the soul and holding it still for the briefest moment before it could slip away. She believed that moment, that collision of sound and spirit, was when she could observe what no one else had the patience to see. Everything she did was arranged around that point, every breath taken or withheld, every heartbeat slowed or forced, all converging on the bell's voice. Her methods shifted as she refined her beliefs. Once, she brought a child to the basement hours before dawn, lowering them waist-deep into a tub of water packed with river ice she had hacked herself from the frozen bank. She kept their arms pinned above the surface, their faces visible, the lips turning pale as she murmured reassurances that sounded like kindness but carried no mercy. The cold slowed the heart until it barely worked at all, yet the brain, starved but still lit, clung to its last reserves. Miriam watched for the slackening of the eyes, the minute tremors in the jaw, and at the exact first chime she placed a warm hand on the back of the neck. When the second chime struck, she pushed their head under and held it there until the body gave the final shudder. She recorded in her hidden ledger that the soul was caught clean that day. Another time she suspended her subject upside down from the rafters, the ankles bound with a strip of linen torn from an altar cloth. She had calculated through earlier attempts how long it would take for gravity to pull the blood toward the head without causing instant loss of consciousness. The face would swell, the eyes redden, but the awareness remained, trapped in a body it could no longer command. Miriam paced the floor beneath them, her rosary turning in her fingers, timing each bead to the tolling bell above. The first chime came and the breath hitched. The second came and she made a swift incision at the base of the neck, enough to lose the blood in a slow stream into a copper basin. She said aloud, in her low and steady voice, that the basin caught more than the body gave. There was nothing frenzied in these acts, no sign of the desperation or heat that marks ordinary killing. Miriam's work was deliberate, her movements economical, as though she were a craftsman handling fragile materials. She cleaned the space before she began, arranged her tools so that nothing interrupted her rhythm, and rehearsed in her mind how each stage would flow into the next. She never began until she was certain of the hour and the distance to the bell's chime. Any variation, any uncertainty, and she would postpone the act until she could ensure perfection. The sisters in the convent above sometimes wondered why Miriam always paused during the bell's toll, even when she was walking through the courtyard or lighting candles in the chapel. They thought it was devotion, a private act of prayer, perhaps the recalling of a name she wished to bless. In truth, she was calibrating herself to the sound, reminding her body of its place within its timing, making sure her pulse aligned with the bell so she could feel the same cadence in her hands when the moment came. In her mind, each life she ended in this way was not simply a death, but an experiment, a test of whether the soul could be startled into stillness. She pictured it like a bird in the dark, motionless in sudden light, wings frozen for just long enough to be grasped. She never considered herself cruel. She saw herself as the only one willing to do what was necessary to reach the truth. Cruelty to her was the waste of opportunity, the letting go of a moment that could never be repeated. When the act was over, she always lingered in the room for a few minutes after the second chime had faded, her gaze fixed on the space just above the body. She breathed slowly, sometimes speaking in a language no one else at St. Aurelia's knew, as though addressing something that had not yet gone. Only when she was certain the moment had passed did she prepare the body for its return to the infirmary, arranging the limbs and folding the hands in the way the other sisters found so reverent. The bell to everyone else was the voice of the convent, calling them to prayer, marking the simple passing of time in a quiet town. But to Miriam it was the instrument that allowed her to touch the edge of a mystery she believed belonged to her alone. And as the months went by, she grew certain that she was no longer working in solitude, that something had begun to answer when the bell rang twice. Father Alban had always been a man of order. In his narrow study above the sacristy, he kept the parish records lined neatly on the shelves, each year marked in black ink along the spine. He had inherited the task from the priest before him, and for nearly 2 decades he had trusted those records the way other men trusted the stars, as fixed points by which all else could be measured. But in the winter of his 15th year at St. Aurelia's, he began to see patterns that did not belong. At first it was small, a handful more burials than usual for the season, nothing that could not be blamed on the cold or bad harvest. Yet when he compared the numbers to the worst influenza years, he found that more children had been lowered into the frozen earth in recent winters than in any time of true pestilence. He told no one. Instead, he pulled the baptism logs from the same years, scanning the careful entries of names and dates. Here, too, the numbers faltered. Entire months passed without a single child christened, only for the next page to be filled with deaths of the same age. Some had no baptism at all recorded, their existence noted only in the burial ledger, as if they had been born and died between the turning of one page and the next. He began copying the details onto scraps of paper, the ink blurring under his thumb as he moved between ledgers, calculating the intervals between deaths. The rhythm was unnerving. Clusters of burials 9 days apart, repeated again and again, with gaps that seemed too precise to be the work of chance. It was the bell that fixed the pattern in his mind. The convent's twice-daily chimes were as familiar to him as his own heartbeat, but as he traced the dates and times recorded by the sisters in their own logs, he began to see the shadow of those bells over the deaths. More than half occurred within the hour of the evening chime, and when he laid the numbers out in a row, they seemed almost to march in time to the sound. The thought unsettled him in a way the numbers alone could not. Bells called the faithful to prayer. They did not call the dying to their graves. As the weeks passed, he watched Sister Miriam more closely, though never in a way that might draw her notice. She moved through the corridors with her usual quiet grace, speaking to the children with a tenderness that seemed unshakable. Yet he could not shake the sense that her presence shadowed every record he had questioned. If a child fell ill, it was Miriam who stayed at the bedside. If one recovered, she had been the one to tend them. If they died, her name was written in the margins as the attending sister. She was woven into the numbers as tightly as the ink itself. Still, Father Alban kept silent. In a place like St. Aurelia's, accusations carried the weight of sin if they were wrong, and worse if they were right. He needed more than suspicion. He needed proof that could withstand the walls of secrecy that protected the convent. So he waited, marking each new death in his private notebook, folding the pages into a small ledger he kept hidden beneath his cassock. But the more he learned, the more the pattern pushed back against him. Each time he felt close to seeing the whole shape of it, another disappearance came, erasing a piece of the path he was following. It did not take long for him to realize that these vanishings were not random. They were people who might have spoken. A kitchen girl who had carried blankets to the infirmary, a grave digger who had noticed the strange weight of a coffin, a visiting nurse who had argued over the treatment of a child. One by one they were gone, reassigned, fallen ill, or simply never seen again. Miriam's face in their absence was always the same, serene, accepting, framed by the quiet dignity of her habit. By the time the snow began to soften at the edges of the roads, Alban knew he was no longer merely keeping records. He was keeping score, and the game was one he had not chosen. The bell still rang twice each day, and he found himself listening with a kind of dread, counting the seconds between the chimes and wondering whose name he would have to write next. The pattern was tightening, and if he could see it, he had to believe she could see him seeing it too. The thaw of 1897 had barely lifted the last sheets of ice from the river when the novice went missing. Her name was Sister Agnes, 17 years old, with a voice the other sisters said could lift even the heaviest winter moods. She was last seen carrying folded linens toward the bell tower stairs, her bare feet silent on the worn wood. No one thought much of it until the following day when her absence was noticed at morning prayers. At first there were murmurs that she had gone to visit her family, then whispers of illness, then finally a quiet, strained silence that spoke of something worse. The convent searched the grounds in measured, orderly fashion, though no one thought to look upward until the third day when a maintenance man was sent to check the ropes in the belfry. She was there, in the dim shadow beneath the massive bell, her body arranged in a way no fall could explain. Her legs were bent wrong at the hips. Her arms folded across her chest as if posed, and a strip of linen was crammed deep into her mouth. Her eyes were open, turned toward the slanted roof beams as though she had been watching for something that never came. The air around her was still heavy with the smell of dust and cold iron. Those who found her spoke in hushed voices afterward, not about what they had seen, but about how it felt, as though the space itself resisted their presence, as though something in the air was waiting for them to leave. The coroner's report was never read aloud in public. It was discovered years later, locked in a desk drawer in the rectory, its ink faded but legible. It told a stranger truth than the official story of an accident. The lungs were not collapsed as they might be in a hanging or fall. They were overfull, stretched and fragile, the tissue inside torn. Her throat bore deep bruising along the inner walls, the kind that could not be made from choking on cloth alone. The conclusion, though never written outright, was plain. Air had been forced into her until the delicate vessels inside ruptured. She had not suffocated. She had drowned on air. In the days after her death, the bell rang on schedule, its double chime carrying over the rooftops, but some claimed it sounded sharper, almost metallic, as if something inside it had shifted. Sister Miriam was seen kneeling alone in the nave that week, her eyes closed, her lips moving soundlessly. Those who passed her assumed she was praying for the dead novice. In truth, Miriam felt no grief. The girl had been curious, too curious, about the patterns of the infirmary, asking why certain children were moved there and others were not. Miriam had noticed the way Agnes lingered in the doorways, her gaze following Miriam's hands as she prepared her tinctures. It had been inevitable. The method had been different this time, and that pleased her. She had always believed the soul could be startled into stillness by the bell, but she had wondered if it could also be driven upward, forced into a moment of sudden release by the body's unnatural inflation. In the belfry, with the rope coiled neatly beside her and the girl bound in a way that kept her upright, she had pressed the leather-covered nozzle to Agnes's lips, squeezing the bellows again and again while listening to the faint wheeze deepen into something wet. The girl's eyes had bulged, her chest swelling beyond its natural shape, the sound in her throat a muffled keening that stopped not when she fought, but when she finally went still. Miriam had held her there through the first chime and released her at the second, certain she had captured something in that fragile instant. The official word was accident. Perhaps a fall, perhaps a faint that left her trapped and unable to call for help. The townsfolk accepted it. In the record books, her name was followed by a cross and a short prayer. But in Miriam's private ledger, the entry was more exact. 2 chimes, full assent, an air vessel ruptured, response unknown. The notation was marked with a small symbol she used only when she believed she had come close to touching the boundary she sought. And as the spring air warmed and the bells kept ringing, Miriam moved through the convent halls as she always did, a figure of composure and care, while in her mind, the image of Agnes's final breath was fixed like a point on a map she was still determined to reach. Father Albin had always moved cautiously, but by the summer of 1897 his caution had turned into something colder, a quiet calculation that mirrored the very woman he sought to unseat. The death of Sister Agnes had shifted something in him. It was no longer a matter of uneasy suspicion. It was a conviction that Sister Miriam's presence in St. Aurelia's was a danger no prayer could contain. He began his campaign the way a man might prepare for confession, gathering every sin, every omission, every faint trace of wrong that could be laid at her feet. But this was not a confession he meant to give to God. It was one he intended for the bishop, the only authority with the power to remove her. He spoke to no one openly, but in the shadows of the rectory and quiet corners of the parish library, he shared whispers with those he trusted. A kitchen sister who had once found a vial of strange liquid in Miriam's apron. A stable boy who claimed he'd seen her carrying a bundle into the cellar at midnight. A nurse from the village who swore a child's fever had worsened the moment Miriam took over his care. Alban wrote their words in a small notebook he kept hidden under the lining of his cassock. Yet the weight of suspicion was not enough. He needed something the bishop could not dismiss as rumor or personal dislike. It was a gravedigger, old enough to have dug more than half the churchyard, who provided the opening. Over ale in the tavern, Alban pressed a coin into the man's palm and asked if he could open a recent burial. Just one, and without the sister's knowledge. The man hesitated, but the coin was heavy and the priest's face carried a kind of desperate resolve. 2 nights later, under a moon that gave just enough light to see by, they pried open the coffin of a boy buried only a fortnight before. The air that rose from it was wrong, dry, with none of the sweet rot of recent death. The body inside was not decomposing. It was packed in fine salt, every fold of skin crusted white, the lips drawn tight as if in mid-breath, and the eyes. They stared upward, lids held open by thin copper wires threaded neatly through the flesh. Alban stepped back, the sight striking him in a way the numbers in his ledgers never could. This was not neglect, not even quiet cruelty. This was deliberate, constructed like an artifact meant to be preserved for purposes unknown. He asked no questions of the gravedigger, who shut the lid without a word and shoveled earth until the grave was whole again. No prayers were said over the work. They left the churchyard in silence, the priest clutching the memory of those pinned eyes as if they were proof enough to damn her. The next morning, Alban wrote to the bishop, his words carefully chosen, omitting details that might seem impossible yet heavy enough to demand action. He sent the letter through a trusted courier, but days passed without reply. It was in those days that Miriam seemed to look at him differently, not with suspicion but with a kind of patient knowing, as though she could see the weight of his secret lodged in his chest. It began subtly. A kitchen sister who had once confided in him collapsed after a sudden illness, her death recorded in the convent's ledger as influenza despite the summer heat. The gravedigger was found drowned in the river, his boots missing, his tools abandoned on the bank. The nurse from the village stopped coming altogether, her family claiming she had taken ill and left for relatives in the north, though no one had seen her depart. One by one, the voices that had murmured to Alban were gone, leaving only silence where there had been quiet agreement. Alban understood then that this was no longer an investigation. It was a war, fought not with open confrontation but with the removal of pieces from a board neither of them could admit existed. Miriam's attacks were precise, never touching him directly but cutting away every ally until his campaign was nothing more than his own voice echoing in an empty room. She continued her work in the infirmary with her familiar calm, attending funerals with her head bowed, speaking to the children in that same measured tone. And yet, whenever the bell rang twice, Alban felt the sound hollowing the air around him, as if the toll itself was a reminder of whose rhythm ruled this place. He began to count not just the dead but the living who might still stand with him, and found that the number was shrinking faster than he could act. Elise arrived at the convent gates in the spring of 1901, unrecognizable from the girl who had once slept in the cold dormitories under its roof. She was 20 now, but her frame was so thin that her bones seemed to carry more weight than her flesh. Her skin was pale and drawn tight, her eyes restless and shadowed, as if every passing sound might strike her from behind. The sisters who answered the door remembered her dimly, an orphan who had left suddenly at 13, taken in by a family in a neighboring parish. But the woman before them was not a returning daughter who came to give thanks. She clutched the gate-post with one hand, the other pressed against her stomach, whispering that she had something Sister Miriam left inside her. Her voice trembled on the words as though even saying them might summon something she feared was still listening. They brought her inside, but she flinched at the sound of the bell as it marked the evening hour. her thin body folding in on itself until the echoes faded. She would not sit in the infirmary, would not take food or drink unless she could see the door, and when asked what she meant by her strange claim, her eyes slid toward the chapel as if expecting someone to walk through. It was only when she was taken to Father Alban, who had not seen her since she was a child, that her story began to come out. She spoke in bursts, her voice dropping to a whisper whenever she reached a certain part, as though the walls themselves might be listening. She told of nights in the convent basement, though not the side where the grain was kept. She remembered being woken by Miriam's hand on her shoulder, her voice low and warm, telling her she was needed for a special devotion. She would be led down the narrow steps past the sacks and barrels into a room lit by a single candle where a copper basin sat beneath a narrow cot. She was told to lie back, and before she could ask why, her wrists and ankles were bound with straps. The cot was tilted so her head hung lower than her feet, her body swaying slightly in the still air. A cut would be made, shallow and precise, and she would listen to the steady sound of her own blood dripping into the basin below. Miriam would murmur prayers in Latin, the words too soft to catch, though Elise was certain they were not prayers she had ever heard in Mass. The sessions lasted hours, broken only by the feel of a damp cloth pressed to her lips or a bitter sip of something that made her head swim. Sometimes Miriam spoke directly to her, telling her she must stay still, that this was sacred work, that she was helping to open a place where the soul could be measured. Elise said she could feel herself growing weaker with each drop, her body floating between waking and sleep, the candlelight blurring until the shadows seemed to move. She began to believe that if she closed her eyes completely, she would not be able to open them again. She survived several of these nights, though she said she could not remember how many. But the last time was different. Another child had been brought down, a boy of no more than 9. Miriam worked between them, her hands steady, her voice calm. Elise remembered the boy beginning to moan, his breath catching in short, frantic bursts. Miriam leaned over him, whispering something Elise could not hear, and then the sound of the dripping stopped. She realized in that moment that the boy was no longer moving. Miriam turned to her, touched her face with the back of her hand, and said she would not be needed again for some time. The next morning, Elise was sent away from the convent with no explanation, placed in the care of a distant parish family who knew nothing of her nights in the basement. She had lived with them in silence for years, until the sound of a church bell during a market day sent her collapsing into the street. Since then, she said, she could not hear the double chime without feeling as though she were once again hanging above that copper basin, the steady drip echoing in her ears. She had come back not for help, but because she was certain that whatever Miriam had begun inside her was still there waiting, and that if she did not speak, it would be finished. Father Alban listened without interrupting, his face a mask that betrayed neither belief nor doubt. But inside he felt the slow, familiar tightening of the pattern he had been tracing for years. Elise's words were another piece of it, one that fit too neatly with the others to be chance. And as the bell rang twice that evening, he watched her flinch again, her whole body bowing under the sound, and knew the war between him and Miriam had just shifted in a way neither could yet see. By the winter of 1903, St. Aurelia's no longer moved with the easy rhythm it once had. The halls were quieter, not with the calm of devotion, but with the absence of those who had once filled them. Half the convent staff were gone, some buried in the frozen ground behind the chapel, others reassigned to far-off parishes without warning, their names crossed from the registers as if they had never belonged there. The orphans spoke less, their play reduced to a kind of watchful stillness, as though they had learned that noise drew notice, and notice was dangerous. Through it all, Sister Miriam's presence was constant, her steps measured, her tone unchanged, her work in the infirmary uninterrupted. But her work had taken on new shapes, darker and more elaborate. The kitchen smelled different on the days she prepared the meals, a faint, chalky scent that clung even after the pots were scrubbed. She had begun grinding bone into a fine powder and stirring it into the soup, explaining to the sisters who asked that it gave strength to the living and closed the gap between them and the dead. At night, thin plumes of smoke rose from the courtyard, where she burned scraps of hair in a small iron brazier, watching until every strand curled into ash. When questioned, she spoke of ritual protections, a way to prevent restless spirits from crossing back into the world of the breathing. The worst of it was reserved for the dead. Miriam had taken to sewing coins into the bodies before burial, slipping them into the mouth, the palms, and sometimes beneath the eyelids. She called them seals, to weigh the spirit down, to keep it from wandering. To Father Alban, they were not protections but violations, deliberate acts meant to claim the dead as her own. More than once he had stood over an open coffin before the funeral, his stomach tightening as he saw the neat stitches along a corpse's jaw, or the faint bulge beneath the skin of the hand. To the others, Miriam's explanations were enough. They saw her as a woman deeply concerned with the souls in her care, willing to go further than anyone else to ensure their safe passage. But to Alban, every act was part of a growing web of control, each ritual another thread binding the convent's dead, and perhaps its living, to her private will. The symbols she carved into the handles of the burial shovels, the small glass jars she kept locked in the infirmary cupboard, the way she timed certain funerals to coincide with the bell's double chime. All of it had begun to form a pattern he could no longer ignore. By January, Alban's resolve had hardened. Quiet warnings to the bishop had led nowhere, and his allies had been reduced to shadows or graves. He understood now that the only way to remove her was to break the silence publicly, to force the truth into the open where it could not be swept back into the dust of the archives. His plan was dangerous, and he knew it. He would speak during Sunday Mass, not in private letters or whispered accusations, but from the pulpit before the congregation and the sisters, while the air was still heavy with incense and the candles still burned at the altar. He would name her deeds, describe the desecrations, and place them in the light of the gospel she claimed to serve. In the weeks before, he prepared not just his words but his heart. He spent hours in the cold of the confessional, kneeling in the dark, whispering prayers that felt more like warnings to himself than to God. He reread the burial records, the ledger of deaths, the notes he had taken from Elise's confession. He knew that if he spoke and failed, the cost would be more than his place in the parish. It would be his life. But each day he hesitated, Miriam continued her work. The bone dust settled into another pot of soup. The brazier smoked again in the courtyard. Another body was lowered into the ground with coins sewn into its flesh. The snow outside grew deeper, muffling the sound of the town beyond the convent walls. Inside, the air was heavy with the damp cold that clung to the stone. Alban felt the season pressing against him, the way winter does when it feels as though it may never end. But he knew this would be the last one they spent together under the same roof. Either his words would free the convent from her, or they would be the last he ever spoke from the altar. And as the bell rang twice in the frozen air, he closed his eyes and imagined the echo breaking just once under the weight of truth. The morning of February 6, 1904, dawned brittle and white, the kind of winter day when the air cut through wool and skin alike. The streets of the town were slick with frost, each footstep crunching on the frozen earth as the people made their way to St. Aurelia's. Mass on a Sunday was a habit, but on this day the pews filled earlier than usual, as if some unspoken summons had passed through the air. The scent of incense clung thick to the nave, mingling with the sharpness of the cold that seeped through the heavy wooden doors. Father Alban stood at the altar, the pages of his missal resting open before him. the weight of his decision pressing down on every breath. The bell in the tower began its first peal, the sound resonating through the stone and into the marrow of those gathered. The doors at the rear opened with a slow creak, and Sister Miriam stepped inside. She moved with the same calm precision she always had, her hands folded neatly, her eyes downcast. Her habit was immaculate, the white of her coif bright against the dark wool of her veil. To the congregation, she appeared as she always did, a figure of quiet piety, the very embodiment of service. But to Alban, watching from the altar, she was the shadow that had walked the halls for more than a decade, cloaked in grace but steeped in something far older and colder than faith. As she passed the pews, the parishioners' heads bowed out of respect, some even reaching to touch her sleeve. She inclined her head in return, her lips moving in what appeared to be prayer. No one noticed that her gaze flickered once toward the tower as the bell's tones swelled and began to fade. She reached the front row, kneeling briefly before rising and turning toward the center aisle. Her pace slowed as though each step was drawn forward by the sound above. The second peal rang out deep and resonant, the tone trembling in the air. Miriam's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. Then, as the last note hung in the nave, she staggered. One hand brushed the edge of the pew for balance, the other pressed briefly to her chest. Her lips parted as though to speak, but no sound emerged. The movement was graceful even in collapse, her knees folding, her body rolling slightly to the side before she crumpled to the stone floor. The congregation gasped in unison, their shock swelling into murmurs that echoed against the walls. Father Alban stepped down from the altar, his steps slow and deliberate. He knelt beside her, resting one hand lightly on her wrist, though he already knew there would be no steady pulse. Her skin had gone pale, her breath shallow, the pupils fixed in a way that told him the work was done. In the folds of her habit, he found what he had known would be there, 3 small glass vials, each no longer than a finger, stopped tightly. Inside each swirled a cloudy liquid, and suspended in that pale murk was a single eyelash. The glass was cool against his palm, the contents shifting sluggishly with each movement. What they were meant for, he could not say. Perhaps they were trophies, perhaps ingredients for something yet unfinished. Perhaps the beginnings of another ritual that would never be carried out. The meaning was locked away with her breath, sealed as tightly as the vials themselves. Alban slipped them into his own pocket without a word, knowing the questions they would raise if seen. Around him the sisters had gathered, their faces pale, their voices low and trembling. The official record would later state that Sister Miriam had suffered a sudden illness during Mass. The truth was simpler and far heavier. The wine she had taken during communion had been blessed by Alban himself, though with a blessing that hid more than holy water. It had been prepared in the stillness of the sacristy, a precise measure of poison chosen not for speed, but for certainty. He had ensured it would take her at the exact moment the second peal rang out, the moment she had always claimed could hold a soul in place. As her body was carried from the nave, her head resting against the shoulder of another sister, the bell above struck once more, this time without pattern, a single echo that faded into the winter air. Alban returned to the altar and continued the Mass without pause, his voice steady, his eyes fixed on the pages before him. But in the pocket of his cassock, the vials pressed against his side like a reminder that though she had fallen, whatever she had gathered, whatever she had done, had not yet been entirely buried. And somewhere in the distance the tower stood silent, as if waiting to see whether the bell would ever again ring twice for her. In the weeks after Sister Miriam's death, the air around St. Aurelia's did not grow lighter. It seemed instead to thicken, as if whatever had lived in the shadows of the convent had not been carried away with her body but had sunk deeper into the earth beneath it. The bishop ordered a cleansing of the grounds, a gesture meant to reassure the town that whatever had festered there would be cut away entirely. Part of that order included the opening of the convent's older graves, not for exhumation in the name of honor, but for examination, to see if the rumors Father Alban had whispered for years had any weight in soil. The first shovels struck frozen dirt, their metal ringing sharp against the frost. When the coffins came up, they were heavier than they should have been for the years they'd lain buried. The workers pried open the lids expecting the brittle remains of natural decay, but what they found were bodies that seemed caught in the middle of struggle. Some were bound at the wrists and ankles with cloth that had stiffened into something like stone, the knots still tight. The mouths of others had been sewn shut with coarse black thread. The stitches crude but unbroken. Knees were broken backward or crushed inward as though to force them into coffins too small for their size. The most unsettling were those whose ears had been sealed with hardened wax, poured while still hot, leaving burns on the skin that had survived even after the rest of the flesh had shrunk away. The bishop's men said little, but their hands shook as they worked. Each grave told the same story. These had not been laid to rest after death. They had been buried in death's direction, sealed in such a way that their final moments had been cut off from any sound or breath beyond the lid. To the townspeople who heard what the workers saw, the images grew sharper in the telling. Some said they had been buried alive to trap the soul inside the body. Others whispered that Miriam had buried them this way to keep them bound to her even in the ground. When the 12th grave was opened and revealed the same pattern, the town's council ordered the work stopped. The graveyard gates were locked and chained, and a wooden barricade was built to seal it from view. What could not be hidden they chose to erase. The basement of the convent was emptied into the courtyard, ledgers, jars, tools, and things no one could name, and burned in a pyre that sent a thick column of black smoke into the sky. The sisters stood at a distance, their faces pale and unreadable, while the townspeople watched in silence, each of them wondering what might have been destroyed that no one had the courage to describe. But fire could not burn away the unease. Whispers persisted in the streets, spoken behind closed shutters and under low voices in the tavern. There were stories of missing bodies, graves that had been marked in the records but when opened held only stones or sand. Some claimed these were the ones Miriam had taken elsewhere for purposes that could not be guessed. Others believed the missing bodies had been buried so deep no one would ever find them, their final resting place somewhere outside consecrated ground. Father Alban did not speak publicly of what he had seen. He carried the knowledge the way a man carries a wound too deep to show, feeling its ache in moments of stillness. He knew the town wanted to believe that with Miriam gone, the last of her work had been buried. But in his mind, the unopened graves were as heavy as the ones they had pried apart. They were the graves no one had dared disturb, the ones that might still hold the truth of her final acts. And as winter dragged on, the locked gates of the graveyard began to rot in the damp, their chains rusting in the snow as though time itself was waiting for the moment when someone else would open them again. The bell had been lowered from the tower within a week of Miriam's burial, its dark bronze surface dulled by years of weather and the oil from countless hands that had pulled its rope. The bishop had ordered it removed, claiming it was to prevent superstition, though everyone knew it was because the sound had become too closely tied to her work. It was taken to the town hall, where it was set in a storage room beside broken furniture and water-stained records, its rope coiled neatly at its base. For nearly 2 decades it sat untouched, collecting dust, its voice silenced by a door that was rarely opened. The children born after her death knew it only as a story, a relic of something their parents would not fully explain. But on the night of February 6, 1922, The 28th anniversary of the morning Miriam had collapsed during Mass. The silence broke. The town was asleep under a thin blanket of snow, the streets empty except for the faint hiss of wind through the alleys. Then, just before dawn, two clear chimes rang out from the town hall. Those who heard it said the sound was not like it had been in the convent days. It was thinner, sharper, with a strange edge that made it seem almost like a voice trying to speak through metal. A few claimed the second chime was longer than the first, trailing off into something that was less echo than breath. By morning, the story had spread through the town. Some dismissed it as a prank, though no one could explain how anyone had gotten into the locked storage room, much less moved the bell without leaving tracks in the snow. Others avoided the subject altogether, unwilling to speak of Miriam aloud, as if her name could make the sound return. But for a handful of the oldest townspeople, the ringing was not an accident. It was a sign, a reminder that she had not been entirely erased. That year, the council agreed to commission a memorial for the town square, a gesture meant to draw a line between the living and the past. Officially, it was dedicated to the children who died unnamed, the phrase carved into a block of pale stone, surrounded by a low iron fence. Families came to place flowers there in spring, and in the autumn the school children were marched past it in solemn rows. Yet there was no record of the names it honored, no dates, no cause of death. In the margins of history, where facts fade into whispered truth, some said it was not for all the town's lost children, but for the ones buried under Miriam's watch. The ones whose deaths were too strange, too cruel to write in any official ledger. Visitors often remarked on the strange hush around the memorial, how the noise of the square seemed to dull as they stepped near it. The stone stayed cold even in summer, and on damp days the carved letters grew dark as though wet from within. Once, a child pressed her ear to the surface and told her mother she heard the sound of dripping water inside, though there was no hollow to hold it. The story spread quietly, never making it to print, but enough to keep some from passing too close after sunset. The bell remained in the town hall, its presence unspoken but never entirely forgotten. On certain nights, the janitor swore he heard the faintest rattle from the storage room, as if the rope had shifted against the floor. No one asked him to check. And as the decades wore on, the two chimes of 1922 became less a fact and more a warning told to children who wandered too close to the memorial's fence. A reminder that silence is not always safe, and that some echoes do not fade just because the source has been buried. Father Albin's record, sealed away after his death, never mentioned the ringing, but in one margin beside Miriam's name he had written only 4 words. The bell remembers her. The handwriting was faint, almost smudged, but still legible. And whether it was superstition or truth, there were those who believed that as long as the bell remained whole, it was only waiting for another hour, another second chime to bring her back into the air of the living once more. A century has passed since the walls of St. Aurelia's last cast their shadow across the cobblestones, and the ground where it stood no longer bears any trace of its angles or its order. The convent was torn down in stages, brick by brick, until the land was left bare and time was allowed to do the rest. Grass grew first, wild and high. Then the creeping roots of trees took hold, breaking through what little foundation remained. By the middle of the last century, the site was nothing but a patch of tangled green, a place locals crossed quickly, eyes fixed on the ground. Children were told not to play there, not because of ghosts, but because of history, a word their elders used like a warning without explanation. The records of its fall were scattered and thin, their official language stripped of the details that had made the air in those years so heavy. Yet the impact lingered in other ways. Laws changed quietly in the aftermath. regulations over orphanages and convent schools, oversight of religious institutions, requirements for unannounced inspections. They were passed without speeches, without fanfare, as though no one wished to attach them to the place that had forced their creation. The amendments were buried in wider bills, their origins left unspoken because to name the source was to reopen the wound. For historians, the question of Sister Miriam remains unsolved, not because the facts are lost, but because the facts refuse to align in any way that satisfies reason. Some insist she was insane, her acts the work of a mind long fractured and allowed to hide within the cloistered safety of the convent. Others speak of possession, pointing to the rituals, the timing, the symbols carved in places only the dead could carry. A colder, more clinical view paints her as a scientist of suffering, someone who had found in the walls of St. Aurelia's the perfect laboratory, a place where life and death could be manipulated without interruption, under the cover of service and piety. Each theory explains something, but none explains it all. The truth perhaps lies in the place where all three meet. She was patient, that much is certain. She moved at a pace the world could not suspect, her cruelty disguised as care, her experiments cloaked in the language of salvation. She worked without rush because she understood the advantage of silence, that in a quiet place the wrong things can grow unnoticed until they have taken root so deeply that pulling them free will leave a hole no one wants to look into. Now the ruins are gone, and the earth has covered what was left, but silence has its own way of remembering. Those who pass the overgrown lot on winter mornings say the air there feels colder than the rest of the street, the kind of cold that has nothing to do with weather. On certain days in February just after dawn, a few claim they hear two distant chimes carried on the wind, thin and strange, fading before they can decide if the sound was real. They do not speak of it to the council or the church. They turn their collars up and walk faster, pretending the thought never came. The story of St. Aurelia's is not one the town tells to visitors, and in the wider world it survives only in footnotes, its details softened by time, stripped of the weight they once carried. Yet in the quiet spaces, the archives, the half-forgotten letters, the whispered memories passed down, there is a shape to the truth that cannot be entirely erased. It is the shape of a bell that no longer hangs, a room without windows, a hand that could cradle the dying as gently as it could guide them there. Evil, when patient, wears a mask of virtue. It walks in the open, it tends to the sick, it buries its dead with prayers. And when it works in silence, it does not need to hide. It simply waits for the moment when the rest of the world is looking away. In that stillness, it can ring twice before anyone dares to speak. What do you think? Could this happen again?